He thought it was just another shift, mopping floors, emptying bins, keeping the gym spotless. But in the space of a single afternoon, he went from invisible to the center of a storm no one saw coming. A respected black belt, surrounded by his students, called him over with a smile and an offer, a friendly spar. What happened next would silence the room, shatter expectations, and expose something far uglier than a fight. This isn't just about martial arts. It's about dignity, prejudice, and the moment one man refused to play his assigned role. Marcus had worked at the community gym for almost 5 years. To most people, he was just the janitor, the man with the quiet smile, who kept the place clean long after the last treadmill stopped humming. He moved through the halls like clockwork, blending into the background while others broke records and chased dreams. What most never saw was the discipline behind his steady hands. Years before, Marcus had trained in boxing at a local rec center, using it to stay grounded and out of trouble. But those days were long behind him. Now, his gloves were for scrubbing floors, not throwing punches. The gym was his second home, but it was also a place where lines were drawn. Some saw him as part of the furniture, someone to nod at but not engage with. And while Marcus never asked for attention, he could feel the weight of those unspoken boundaries. That afternoon was no different, until it was. A crowd had gathered near the mats, laughter echoing off the walls. In the middle stood Ethan, a celebrated black belt with a reputation for dominating every sparring session. When his eyes landed on Marcus, something shifted in the air. With a smirk, he called out across the room, inviting the janitor into the circle. It was framed as a joke. But Marcus knew, jokes have a way of cutting the deepest. Marcus hesitated for a moment, the mop still damp in his hands. The invitation didn't sound like an invitation at all. It felt like a dare. The room seemed to lean in, waiting for his reaction. He'd learned long ago that in certain spaces, the wrong response, too proud, too timid, could follow you like a shadow. Ethan's tone was light, but his eyes told a different story. This wasn't about a friendly exchange. It was about putting Marcus in his place. Around them, whispers rose, half amusement, half anticipation. Some smirked, others crossed their arms, ready for a show. Marcus wiped his hands on his work pants, stepping toward the mat. Inside, his chest tightened, not from fear of the fight, but from the weight of what was really happening. He knew this look, this energy. It was the same edge he'd felt as a teenager in school hallways, when a teacher would single him out for something others got away with. The same cold burn he'd felt at job interviews when they decided who he was before he even spoke. The crowd parted, letting him through. He noticed the phones come out, small glowing rectangles ready to record his humiliation. If he refused, the story would be that he was scared. If he agreed, the game was rigged for him to lose. Either way, he'd be the janitor in someone's story, a prop for someone else's entertainment. Ethan greeted him with exaggerated politeness, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He offered Marcus a pair of gloves, the kind meant for beginners. The implication was clear. You don't belong here, so we'll keep it safe for you. Marcus took them without a word. The first exchange was cautious, Ethan throwing light jabs while circling. But soon, his pace quickened, his hits landing harder than necessary. It wasn't sparring, it was a performance. Every sharp strike was followed by a glance to the crowd, as if to say, watch me put him in his place. Marcus absorbed the blows. His mind split between the pain in his ribs and the deeper sting beneath it. He knew the room wasn't watching a contest, they were watching a hierarchy play out in real time. Then came a hit too high, catching him across the face. The crowd let out a collective, "Oh!" Phones angling for a better shot. Marcus stumbled back, his breath ragged. In that moment he had a choice. Step out and let the story be written for him, or step forward and take control of it. He tightened his stance. His eyes locked on Ethan's, not as a janitor looking at a champion, but as a man refusing to be belittled. The noise around him faded, replaced by the steady beat of his own pulse. The next move would decide everything. Ethan came in fast, confident, certain that this would end on his terms. He threw a sharp combination, the kind meant to overwhelm, to make the other man fold. But Marcus didn't flinch. He stepped inside the arc of the punch, absorbing its force, feeling the sting, but also feeling something else. Control shifting, however slightly. The crowd's tone began to change. The laughter quieted, replaced by murmurs. A few people lowered their phones, sensing that what was happening wasn't part of the script. Ethan's strikes grew heavier, almost frantic now, each one a little less precise. Marcus remembered every hallway he'd been made to walk through like an outsider, every smirk that told him he didn't belong. He let the memory fuel his movement, not wild but measured. He parried, he sidestepped, and then, in one clean, unhesitating motion, he landed a strike of his own. Not meant to hurt, but to say, "I am here. I will not be your spectacle." The sound echoed across the mat. Ethan stumbled, surprise flashing across his face. A moment of disbelief that the man he'd expected to humiliate was still standing and pushing back. For a heartbeat, everything froze. Marcus stood tall, chest rising and falling, meeting Ethan's stare without blinking. The crowd leaned in, waiting for the explosion, the retaliation, the inevitable reclaiming of dominance. But Ethan didn't strike. His hands lowered slightly, his expression darkening. Not from physical pain, but from something deeper, the realization that the narrative had slipped from his grasp. Marcus had refused to be the punchline. And in that refusal, the balance had shifted, not in the score of punches, but in the unspoken power that hung in the air. The room was silent, and in that silence, the truth was deafening. Ethan stepped back, forcing a tight smile, the kind that hides more than it reveals. He mumbled something about good effort and offered a half-hearted handshake, but the moment had already outgrown him. The crowd slowly dispersed, some avoiding Marcus's eyes, others stealing glances that felt different now. Not pitying, not mocking, but curious, maybe even respectful. Marcus left the mat quietly, returning to his mop and bucket as if nothing had happened. But inside, something had shifted. He hadn't won a championship, hadn't beaten a black belt in the traditional sense. What he had done was far more important. He had stood in a space where he wasn't meant to stand, and refused to shrink. That day stayed with him, not because of the punches, but because of the unspoken truth it revealed. The match had never been about martial arts. It was about a hierarchy that saw him as lesser before he even stepped onto the mat. And it was about breaking that expectation, even for just a moment. Marcus knew the fight wasn't over. The stares, the assumptions, the subtle lines drawn around people like him, they wouldn't disappear with one act of defiance. But he also knew something else. Every time someone refuses to accept the role they've been assigned, the story begins to change. And maybe that's how it starts. Not with grand speeches, but with quiet acts of courage in places no one expects. So the question is, how many more will have to stand on that mat, in whatever form it takes in their own lives, before dignity isn't something to be defended, but something that's simply given? If the story touched you, subscribe for more real stories that matter. See how people stay strong even when treated unfairly. Join us for more stories where hurt turns into hope.